I always talk to our team and I tell them, like, your focus is to allow all of our reps to not have to think about the systems. That's what we should be doing. It should be so straightforward and so easy that their only focus is satisfying the customer.
Welcome to RevOps Rockstars, in pursuit of unicorns. I'm David Carnes.
And I'm Jarin Chu. Join us as we interview RevOps leaders to explore the challenges they have faced, the biggest lessons they've learned, and what they think makes a RevOps rockstar.
This show is brought to you by OpFocus, on a mission to help companies run their businesses better by letting you focus on growth while we scale your operations. Let's get this show on the road.
Today's guest is a friend of OpFocus who we're thrilled to have on the show. He's a seasoned RevOps professional, a Salesforce savant with over 12 years of experience, and he's brought these skills to companies including Conga and Angie's List. We're talking to Senior Director of IT at Sisense today. Welcome to the show, Stas Daszkiewicz.
Great, thanks for having me.
All right, Stas, we're thrilled to have you with us this afternoon. And we really like to ask a question that just gets right to the heart of learning for our listeners. We want to know something that in RevOps that you've had to learn the hard way.
Sure. There's been many lessons. Probably the number one lesson I've learned is nothing is irreversible, but the time to reverse it is all depending on how much prep you've done. And, you know, I think everyone thinks of those big major mistakes they've made or those one like cold sweat moments that you received through your career. And for me, you know, there's two that come to mind. There's one in which at Angie's List, we had, you know, millions and millions of records within our system. And as any good Salesforce person would do, you do data loads, uploads, changes, et cetera, to mass amounts of data. And early in my career, you know, I would do a download of the file. I would then go ahead and modify that file, thinking everything was going to be good, as opposed to making a duplicate of said file. And one time I downloaded my file. I was making all the changes that I wanted to make. It was a pretty large set of records. Pushed a button. And then after it went through, realized I had made a mistake. And I did not save that file as a separate file, which made it really difficult for me to go and correct the issue. So that cold sweat moment, right? I think we've all felt that, like, you realize something went wrong and now you have to go and fix it. And so
I've got a few of those stories too. Totally
yes,
know
right?
what you're saying.
You do it once and then you probably don't do it again. But
yeah.
Luckily for me, you know, as Angie's List was, we had really good backup plans for things like this. You know, we had different products. I'll name drop, you know, Own Backup was a little software that we leveraged. And so I was able to go and grab the information again from the day prior, but then having to go and review that file, do all your VLOOKUPs, do all the, like, it would have been so much easier if I just would have saved a duplicate and then reloaded the original file back in. So, like, nothing's irreversible, but the way you prepare for things either make it easier or harder on yourself.
I think that's great advice. So nothing's irreversible, but certainly planning ahead, taking all your steps. I think in the carpentry world, they talk about measuring twice and cutting once as sort of
yes.
Good words
exactly
of wisdom.
right.
And I feel like those words of wisdoms are thousands of years old, passed from carpenter to carpenter to carpenter.
It's so true. And, you know, you know those rules and you know that's the lessons you should be taking, but it doesn't hit home until you have to leverage it.
Well, that's great. Thank you for sharing.
Of course.
Your title, Stas, is Senior Director of IT, but I know from having worked with you and your team for several years now, that title probably does not truly encompass all of the kinds of things you do. What does your role entail, and what is your involvement with RevOps?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, you know, IT has this. I'm not even sure how to phrase it. It has, I don't want to say a negative view, but people think of IT and they think of people who are working on computers. They're fixing your computer that you have. They're answering a bunch of tickets. But in reality, I mean, it's much bigger than that. And it's not the IT of, 20 years ago, in my opinion. And so my team, essentially, I have three different departments within my team. I have traditional IT, who's responsible for the software, is responsible for ticket management, responsible for ensuring that, everyone has what they need within their computers. I have IT infrastructure, which is responsible for, our data centers and where we house a lot of our own internal products and details. And then I have business systems, right? And business systems is responsible for, the go-to-market tech stack, Salesforce, Outreach, Marketo, all those things that everyone uses day in, day out. What we always talk about, and within my teams, is we talk about process first and technology second, even though we are the systems IT department. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with, a stakeholder and we've gone through some of the issues or the things they're wanting to correct. And too often I've seen teams prescriptively say, oh, well, we can solve it with this technology, as opposed to taking a step back and understand what is the true issue we're having. Could it be solved through training? Could it be solved through, actual onboarding people a little better? Could it be solved through a process change and maybe we remove some button clicks as opposed to an entirely new technology? And so I think that's a new push that I've seen a lot with different companies, where the IT house is no longer in its own little silo off to the side. They're now more part of business operations and RevOps holistically. And, my counterparts are the data analysts, the enablement team, as well as RevOps as a whole. So we're all part of one organization, and we're trying to push the company holistically together in terms of processing the technology that solves it, enabling them, and then reporting on the results. And that's how I view RevOps.
Wow. I'm hearing a lot of crossover. I mean, I'm hearing, you mentioned, of course, the analytics piece, you mentioned business systems, but also I feel like I guess this is maybe more of a theoretical, philosophical question. Do you feel like IT and business operations in a modernized company are starting to see more overlap? Are they becoming terms for each other, used interchangeably? What's your perspective on that? And maybe let's tie it to whether each of those functions measure success differently. Is it the objective that differs, that separates the functions in a modern SaaS company like yours?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think there's more and more overlap. And I do think the measurements of success are starting to bleed into each other. When we go to put in a technology, let's say that we purchase a brand new technology, and then we want to install that into our software and into the process and the day-to-day lives of our employees. The first people that we work with are not only the stakeholders who want to use this software, but essentially the RevOps leaders who's going to help manage their project maybe holistically, right? We are partnering with them to say, okay, we want to do X, Y, Z. We're the experts to tell you, well, I think you should do it in this order. I don't think that the technology will support X, Y, Z. Let's think about it this way. And so there's so much more partnership and overlap with these teams, where I think, IT business systems need to have more business thoughts than ever, because we're so embedded in the daily lives of our employees. I challenge any company to be working on just their phones, right? No one is literally just making phone calls anymore and talking through things through emails and et cetera, right? There's 10 to 15 systems per company, without a question. And so because we are, as a technology, so much more embedded in the day-to-day of every one of our employees, we have to know how the business functions in order to support them.
Let me go one step further, because IT over the years, because of that lack of alignment with a clear revenue perspective, has often been relegated and maybe considered even as a cost center. How do you tie revenue or ROI, or really how you move the needle in the business when you are overseeing so many things behind the scenes, in addition to the end user processes that you touch every day?
Yeah, that's a great question. We still are considered a cost, right? Because it is still pretty difficult to tie us into ROI. However, some of the ways that I kind of phrase that question when I'm explain it to the executive level is, every click that I can take away from a sales rep. Everything, every last little field they have to put in is another minute or second that they're on a phone with a possible client or a customer, right? So the more and more of these technologies that are doing parts of their job that they had to do in the past, the more time I'm enabling them to sell, which is what's going to bring in the dollars. And that's the way I try to tie in what our team does to support revenue.
I like that. It's very succinct what you just said, which is if there's a direct impact on the end user being able to do their job more and better, then of course they'll be able to drive more dollars into the door. And that helps support the different initiatives that you end up working, many of which probably are long-term and strategic. And I think of it maybe closer to how politicians never really want to work on, what is it called? The water, the sewage systems. We're seeing the floods and the issues with the weather in California right now. Those are not glamorous, but they're the must-haves in order for a city, or in this case, a revenue team, to function.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I always talk to our team and I tell them, like, your focus is to allow all of our reps to not have to think about the systems. That's what we should be doing. It should be so straightforward and so easy that their only focus is satisfying the customer.
So then enablement takes on a more important meaning with all the work that you're doing to just make sure that you're onboarding folks and retraining and ensuring with all the new hires as the organization's growing that you're continuously providing that guidance. So that must be an interesting challenge. Is that a separate headcount on your team, or is that just something that everyone is taking part in?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So for me, in my current role and my past role, we have an enablement director who is part of the business operations team. We all report to the same person, right? And so we're rowing in the same direction of, hey, I'm hearing this from the field, or hey, we need more enablement at this. In fact, they're usually my go-to on, hey, what's wrong, or what are the processes we can correct? What do the people complain about? They're a direct line into what we're seeing on the field. And when we talk about new systems, they're the first people I tap on the shoulder, go, hey, we're about to do X, Y, Z to improve people's lives. I need you to rah for me and get people up to speed.
Yeah, and it's so important. I think for years, systems was sort of given, if there's a 2 or 3 day sales kickoff, either on day 2 in the late afternoon or day 3 as we're just about to leave, we'll give you a half an hour to do training.
Yep.
But actually these, there's so many productivity tools that really can shave off time. We think of things like CPQ or, some of the amazing technology around calendaring and calling that can shave so much time off of someone's day. That it's really imperative that we think of this. I'm so glad to hear that you have that enablement role where that's a focus.
Yeah, it's vital to ensuring that the things that we're building will actually be used. Right, that's the other big piece of it.
So Sisense is Series F. You took $100 million in funding in 2020. You've got 736 employees, 737 as of right now on LinkedIn. There's just a real interesting amount of complexity that you're dealing with, and then looking ahead at the growth of the company to come. I'm curious with regard to the team. How do you determine the right balance of in-house versus outsourced work?
Yeah, for me, I think there's really 3 things that help me determine whether we're going to go outside or we're going to keep this internally. One of them is how quickly it needs to be done is probably a major factor, right? So if we're talking about a very quick turnaround and my team's already been earmarked for several different projects, that's often a time I'm going to, bring in expertise and bring in an outside resource. Or if there is, in-house knowledge of this thing or this process we're wanting to implement or this new tool, or lack of, will help determine whether I'm going to bring outside resources, right? So if I don't have an expertise, let's say, for example, CPQ, and I need some advice on how to properly stand up a new CPQ system, I want to take it from the experts who's done it for 10, 15, 20 plus companies and then seeing all the different things that are out there. What I also want to make sure though is when I bring in external resources that are going to help work a project, there always has to be an internal resource hip to hip with those individuals, because when they leave, it's now our responsibility. And, my advice is if you are running a team to help, and you are bringing external resources in, make sure your internal team knows exactly what's going on every moment. It's vital.
And I think those are the strongest relationships that we have, where we can have that working hip to hip and have the knowledge transfer. And that knowledge transfer goes both ways, really trying to understand more about your business, your goals, the strategies for achieving the goals. It's so important to us, and having that alignment with someone internally. And I commend you for doing it the way that you're doing it, because a lot of organizations either have no one or they haven't allocated anyone to that learning, especially with something like CPQ. Just knowing the complexity of, because new products will be added, price books have to be updated, pricing has to be updated. It's complicated.
It is. And it's always good to learn from the experts who have seen, many different features or have the knowledge of how other people have implemented it and can point out, where the landmines are so you don't step on them.
And are you hiring for your team, just out of curiosity?
We are. We have a couple different positions within our BizOps team, some within mine, some within, RevOps and data. So check out our career page at Sisense. And like I said, we're continually growing company.
Cool. That's great.
You've already mentioned, Stas, a whole bunch of cross-functional ways you're involved. We find that often when we're speaking to RevOps leaders, they end up taking on some really interesting, unexpected cross-functional corporate level initiatives because it just doesn't really have an owner elsewhere. In your position and your role, which is so integrated with all these other functions, are there some initiatives that you've been either asked to take on or that you've taken on because you're like, hey, this is really going to make an impact and this is the right thing for me to just raise my hand and go ahead and do?
Yeah, within systems teams, we see a lot. We see how all the inner workings are, throughout the company. And an example that I've had experience with before that you wouldn't traditionally see under, BizOps or an IT system team is license management. So for example, you would expect license management to live within product and within an engineering team. And it does. And in organizations I've worked with, but what we often don't think about is a lot of times the source of truth of what a company has or what they're entitled to or what they own resides within your CRM, right? And so oftentimes you'll see that the start of a license management, the start of getting people access comes from out of those CRMs. And you end up having to manage what you would expect product engineering to work with within your business systems team to ensure that those two things are tied together well. We're experiencing that now, and we're continuing to make iterations on it. But it's something you wouldn't traditionally think as a IT systems responsibility.
Can you talk a little bit more around the license management piece? Because I know often things like provisioning, the speed in which you can onboard a customer, that affects, of course, how quickly the business can consider that account ready and healthy and, then of course, future for cross-sell, upsell. How do you measure the success of an initiative like that?
Yeah, I think we use a combination of different things. One of the big ones would be NPS score of the company, right? So because you just pointed out, we're helping a customer get up to speed as quickly as possible, and we're enabling them access to the actual software. Our NPS score reflects our ability to do that. I think, the other thing I would measure against is just time to value. So how quickly can we get someone access? How quickly can we provision? One of the things we'll start to, as I said earlier, like a lot of times it'll start out of your CRM in terms of closing a contract, getting the customer to come in. And because of that, you have the ability to automate a lot of onboarding processes within your CRM that would require a lot of engineering work if you were to hand it over to the other side. So I think there are other things that you could take advantage of because of the nature of these CRMs and the ability to automate things through workflows. You get time to value much quicker than you would hire an engineer to put a bunch of processes in the back end.
I think that's so important, and we've seen it many times over the years in a couple different ways. But if we can get that handshake between the systems team and the engineering team, it is amazing if we can actually speak the same language and divvy up the work where the work's being done, because we can schedule Apex, because we can schedule flows, because we can choose to do some of the heavy lifting on the CRM platform instead of on whatever the SaaS platform. That partnership sounds great. So I'm glad that you've achieved that.
Yeah, I mean, you said it best. Like it becomes so much easier for us to manage those types of things because of all the things that we're able to do within Salesforce itself. Sometimes you can accomplish it even with just an admin.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so why don't we stay on the technology topic, since we've got a lot to talk about there. Is there a tool in your tech stack that you could not live without?
Yeah, for me, one of the tools that has really shown a good ROI for me, I value a lot, would be Marketo. And so for those who aren't familiar with what Marketo is, it's essentially a DevOps tool that allows you to, really streamline your movement of code, Apex data, whatever you need from sandbox to sandbox and into production. And not only move the information, but also track the movement so you can have auditing purposes if you are getting audited at some point. And so that tool for me, if you ever use change sets and having to scroll through all these different, objects and all the different pages to just go select one field and then do it all again. I mean, just that sheer time savings you have with Marketo and the ability to search for metadata and build a search for information and to set up clear, concise sandbox relationships and your walk down. And not only that, the other nice thing that I'll give another Marketo plug is you can, backfill things from production. So let's say that you have 3 or 4 different sandboxes that are feeding into a full sandbox for your testing and QA purposes, and then you push that into production. After completion, you can backfill all that with the click of a button that goes back and seeds all that information to your other sandboxes to ensure that people who are working on that sandbox has the most information up to production, as opposed to having to refresh the whole sandbox and maybe nuke what they might have been working on. So that tool has been invaluable for me. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we hear good things about the collaboration, especially for a growing team. The more cooks in the kitchen, you need that coordination. And with so many companies using 10, 20 or more sandboxes now, that coordination is essential.
Yes, I completely agree.
So I know that analytics are important to you. I'm curious, where do you get your at-a-glance view of what's going on?
Yeah, for us, I'm a big component of drinking your own champagne, eating your own dog food, however you want to phrase it, negative or positive, right? But, Sisense being a data analytics platform, we leverage our internal tools as much as we can. And so we feed a lot of our Salesforce data directly into, our product. And then we leverage that product throughout the company, embedding it directly into Salesforce, embedding it directly into Slack. We have different ways that we can leverage our product in many different products that are out there. And so I'm a big component of leveraging Sisense as a whole. And, the company is able to see exactly what's going on because we're feeding it not only data from Salesforce, but data from all sorts of softwares that we use internally. And so, and we have, our data analytics team is a separate division that is part of BizOps. We talked about that beginning to end process and how I think it should all be under that one organization. So I partner with, our director often about different data points that we're bringing in, or we're just introduced this new CPQ process, and you need to make sure that you're pulling those fields in. So once again, that connection to data analytics holistically under the BizOps umbrella is so vital because you're all aware of what each other are doing.
Is there any platform or tool that you rely on for a health check?
I don't necessarily have a specific tool that I leverage for a health check. I do run that Salesforce health check every once in a while just to see how we are in terms of limits and et cetera. But I personally don't actually have a specific health check software that I use. Happy to hear traditional suggestions though.
I'd love to shift to talk about the future of RevOps. And is there anything that's exciting you about where things are headed with RevOps?
Yeah, I think for me, it's the idea of this BizOps group becoming a thing. I'm seeing it more and more in different companies and companies I've worked with, where IT, RevOps, data analytics, onboarding, they're all one group rowing in the same direction. And it excites me, the idea of having that as an organization, because the collaboration of those groups really is what makes a company run, in my opinion. And so I really am excited to see the continuous growth of that. I'm also honestly I'm excited to see the continuous growth of softwares that allow, general BAs or admins leverage them and do what developers had to do 10 years ago, right? Every software now is trying to ensure that our BAs are able to enable and do the work themselves, which goes back to the point about, like, it's so important that our IT teams and our systems teams know how the business is going to run, because oftentimes they can take the requirements and they go knock them out themselves, which is a huge time saver.
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad we didn't stop when, like in the early days of web development, when you'd have some of these tools like Dreamweaver and some of the other ones, and you'd look at the underlying code that was spit out and you go, dear God, what is this mess? And it sort of looked good on the page, but underneath the hood. So I'm glad, thinking now, some of these tools are really doing quite great things for us, allowing and just seeing all the changes within Salesforce's automation, for example, and the move toward flow, and how that's empowering, like you said, BAs to really do a lot more. And hopefully not harm, because they can cycle through thousands of records very quickly.
Yes, that's where you need to make sure you have a good solutions architect that's there to review every time.
Yeah, that's great.
For someone with so many operations, analytics, technology, talents, I'm super interested in understanding how you got here. I know most people's paths are quite unconventional. If I understand correctly, you're currently in Indianapolis.
Yes.
And you got your undergrad from Ball State University, a general studies degree. And prior to joining Sisense in the IT team, you were director of enterprise systems and data science at Conga. Paint me a picture from university to, your earlier roles to now. How did you get to Sisense? How did you get into enterprise applications?
Yeah, as you said, like, mine's also very unconventional in the path that I've made. I started actually at Angie's List, right in the call center directly out of college. So my job was to take phone calls from companies who wanted to be on Angie's List. And when I joined Angie's List, we were a company of like 300 employees. So not the Angie's List you see commercials for nowadays. We were much, much smaller and scrappier back then. And so I did that for a year and a half, almost 2 years, just taking calls. And actually at Angie's List, we had a homegrown internal CRM, right? We did not use anything else. It was all built by engineering, and it was quite cumbersome, if I'm being honest. And so we actually introduced Salesforce my second year there at Angie's List. And so I got wind of this kind of software, and I always had, a knack for technology. I was always the one that was trying to, play around with different things on the side. Also, I really enjoyed operations as a whole. I enjoy seeing a problem and trying to solve it with a process. And so I happened to know the person that was responsible for embedding Salesforce into Angie's List. And so I just kept conversations with them and honestly just networked and chatted with them. And so what happened after the call center is I actually went into QA, where I was QAing people who were calling to see how they were performing and give them tips and tricks. And that actually turned into an enablement job. So I actually ran enablement for one of our divisions at Angie's List. It was known as the Big Deal. So we were kind of like a competitor against Groupon. And I loved, just teaching people how to make things a little more efficient or have, better phone calls and et cetera, bring my experience talking to people. But I always still had that little itch to, work on operations or work on systems. So, as any good individual who just embedded Salesforce for the first time, they don't know that you should shut down admin rights to people. So I happened to get an admin privileges to Salesforce at the time when I was in the enablement team. And so I started working with my director who was in charge of that division and go, hey, I think we can make some tweaks here on our Salesforce page. I think we can make some updates here. And I asked my buddy, like, are you okay if I just start making changes? He said, yeah, sure. So that I just started making updates and I started, updating the way I think it should move within our organization. So I think he finally realized that I probably shouldn't be doing that in this own complete under umbrella. So he asked me to join his team. And that was my kind of way into Salesforce and operations as a whole. It was, so yeah. So I think the networking is probably the most important thing, my advice there. So from there, after being, administrator for a couple of years under the Angels umbrella, we went public. We eventually sold to Home Advisor. They put those two companies together, and I kind of moved on to another company, which was Conga. And I joined Conga as a solutions architect because I was essentially a senior admin there at Angeles and had experience with Salesforce quite a bit. And at Conga, we actually didn't have a dedicated team that was responsible for internal systems. It was kind of shared within the actually service department there at Conga. And, we made some pushes to really try to separate and carve that out into a true team that I eventually got to, run and take over. And we also included the data analytics team as part of that organization because I think they still, go hand in hand together. And from there, it brought me into that whole realm of running a team of business systems teams. And then eventually, Conga was acquired by Aptus. They combined those two companies together. I decided that it was probably the right time for me to move on. And so I joined Sisense, the data analytics platform, as, the same role, essentially that systems managing director who was running the internal systems. We eventually, our IT head, who was a director, was a partner of mine, eventually left Sisense, and I was asked, hey, do you want to take on IT? And I said yes, because I was excited for the challenge. And so it's, unconventional. It's not your typical path, but I think it speaks to if you're doing what you're doing now very well and you continue to push yourself on learning new, ways of accomplishing things or training on things that don't even fall under your umbrella, it becomes much easier for someone to say, hey, something happened. Do you want to take this on?
Yeah, I'm hearing that you not only embraced the opportunity, but also you started doing some of that work before you formally got the role, right? You were willing to kind of roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty, jump in. And then when your friend and your, future team manager was like, oh, okay, I think it's time for us to make this a little bit more formalized, you already knew a lot of what you required in the next role to be successful.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think, advice I received from one of my mentors was, don't do the job you have, do the job you want. And so if you're already doing the job you want, it becomes much easier decision to give you that job when it's time.
You mentioned, of course, Sisense and how you got there, the path there. You are obviously very focused on the analytics side. Maybe for the folks who don't know, who are listening to the podcast, could you give us an idea of what Sisense does and what you are trying to accomplish in the marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sisense is an analytics platform that allows you to do many different types of reporting and analytics. But one of the big pushes that we have is we infuse analytics into your day-to-day, right? So as opposed to having to go and pull up a dashboard and read the information, et cetera, maybe you ask a question in Slack and we throw some data points or a dashboard directly in there, right? So the idea of Sisense is to infuse analytics everywhere, right? Use the systems that you're using day in and day out, and then provide the information when you're ready to look at that. And so our main focus is working with customers who want to infuse analytics, not only in their internal systems for their internal use cases, but also their actual product themselves. So we put Sisense on your platform to provide analytics for the customers that might want to know what's going on with their service that they have with you.
Very, very cool. The next but related question goes back to some of your path, right? You had to learn on the job. You jumped in and played with stuff. What were kind of the resources you used along the way, or maybe even resources you continue to use to help you stay on the cutting edge of systems and processes and what's best practices?
Yeah. And, first and foremost, I think Salesforce does an absolute amazing job of providing training and enablement, right? The trailhead is unbelievable. And I really wish more companies would start to embrace that more and more, because you can do anything and everything within Salesforce on your own learning path. So, if you focus on the Salesforce realm, Trailhead, go in Trailhead and be a Trailhead expert. But there's other programs like Udemy or LinkedIn Learning. Like, there's tons of different online courses that are often free or at very little cost that can teach you any element that's out there. The other thing that I try to, look at and read is different blogs about future iterations, or from, people that I respect and want advice from. As we discussed earlier, do the job you want, not the one you have, right? So often we'll look at CIO blogs and what are they talking about? What are the cutting edges they're thinking through? What are the problems they're trying to solve? And so I'm often just looking at other peers and people above me and what are they thinking about, and why am I not thinking about that?
That's really great, using a variety of courses available online, different blogs, thought leadership, podcasts like this, perhaps, to be able to validate and understand what's going on outside. Because you mentioned advice, I wanted to turn the advice question actually back on you, Stas. When you look back at the time you've so far spent at Sisense, what would be advice that you gave to yourself on day one of your current role?
Yeah, it's a tough question. But I think the advice I would give is expand your network as soonly as possible, right? And so, we talked about the opportunities I had to take on that admin role that really, in my opinion, catapulted my career. I think if I wasn't talking to individuals or poking around or trying to network, and really, I probably could have even done a much better job earlier on in my career. I don't know what opportunities would have been presented to me. I can't remember the percentage, but often people will talk about getting a new job is a percentage of skills, it's a percentage of who you know, and it's a percentage of luck. And so, anytime you can try to work on all three of at least the first two, the better off you're going to be. And so, I think network. Talk to people in your career. Talk to people who you want to work with in the future. Talk about people who are at a level that you want to be at, because often those are the people that will be able to either get you a job or connect you to someone who can.
What great advice. And I think about those of us, our inner tech geeks, our inner operations process focused, professionals. We just want to jump in, solve problems, get it done. But so much of getting it done is being able to know who can help you get it done and who can help you move along in your career and your journey. That's awesome. Stas.
Yeah,
thank you.
You're exactly right.
And you wonder how much of that has changed. I think back to the third software company, the last software company that I worked at, how important the foosball table was for networking and for talking about things. And, the hundreds of hours late at night and at weird hours and during breaks during the day, spending, playing foosball, those conversations and how important those conversations were for me. So does that change in a largely virtual world where companies are shaving off office space and that sort of thing? You wonder.
Yeah. It becomes a lot more difficult, but still so vital. I mean, you made such a great point. Like, those times where it's something you need a favor or you need someone to assist you, man, it's a lot easier if they know who you are and you were networking them. I can tell you that.
Oh, that's great. So I have a hint at what the answer might be to this, but I'm really curious. So you've shared your career journey with us. and what a cool journey it was. I'm curious, like, what's out there on the bucket list career-wise? And you mentioned CIO a moment ago, but I don't want to lead the witness.
Yeah. For me, that is probably kind of the end goal, is that CIO, possibly COO position. I love operations. I love technology, and I love enabling people to leverage both of those things to make their lives easier. And so I still obviously have some more learning to do before I'm ready for one of those. But I want to be able to help, enable the executives and give them advice on what we need to do technology-wise or operations-wise to make something run more smoothly. And I think I can provide that. And that's really kind of my end goal in my career.
Very cool. We're seeing a lot of trend toward the COO as a future step after RevOps. I love for you that the CIO is out there as well, and that makes a lot of good sense. So I'm excited for you and look forward to tracking that as you progress along. So the role you have is pretty intense. The roles you're talking about in the future are pretty intense. What do you do to unwind?
Yeah. So for me, there's two kind of major things I do. One is I love camping and hiking. I love being in the outdoors. And I think it's probably a nature of what I do in my career, right? Being in front of a screen and thinking about technology. But I always joke with my manager, when I take vacations, I go to like these crazy remote, like forest areas where there is no sense of technology and no way of communicating with me, even if you could, right? And so, like, for me, that is my unwinding time to really get away from the technology and the day-to-day.
I always thought people gave that as an excuse. So you're saying you really are headed to Siberia or northern Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I do like Banff in northern Canada, like where there's zero cell phone reception for miles and miles and miles. That is an ideal vacation for me.
Cool.
And then, the other thing for me is actually I really enjoy woodworking, and I like to build things with my hands. One of the things, with my career and my job is we're constantly, in technology, we're constantly looking at computers, we're constantly, pumping out awesome things that make huge impacts, but there's nothing tangible ever with that. And there's something very satisfying to me when I complete a woodworking project and you can just hold it. Like, I built this thing. And that's another way that I kind of turn off the mind for a little bit and just focus on simple things.
I had a flash of Tom Hanks talking to the Nelson, was it Nelson, the volleyball, saying, fire, yeah. I created yes, fire. And exactly. He's marooned on the island. But that's great. It's so important that we all have these ways to unwind. And it sounds like you have two perfect ones.
Yes. Yeah. It's vital to be able to check out, to give your mind a break, because I know how intensive, all of our careers can be. And so getting that thing that has nothing to do with your career to check out, I think is so important.
Do you have a place where people can check out some of those creations of yours? Do you offer some of your creations to the public?
Yeah, so I'm on the hiatus right now, but I'm hoping to turn on my Etsy shop. It's actually called Daz Timbers. I've built tables. I've built, something as simple as large Jenga sets. I just recently actually built a chicken coop. We decided to get chickens at my house, and so I do have that service. Like I said, it's on hiatus until I can get a couple other things in line. But feel free to check me out.
Cool. We'll definitely include a link to your woodworking shop in the show notes for folks who want to check out what a IT and RevOps leader does outside of work. That's so cool, Stas.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our last question here that we love to ask on the podcast really is, in a way, giving a head nod and homage to a lot of the folks who have helped us along the way, folks in the space in RevOps that have inspired us. What are some of the folks you look up to and you admire in RevOps? And are there any of them who should be on the podcast?
Yeah, I think probably the first person that comes to mind is my current manager, Mike Sitter. I've worked with him at two companies now. He's taught me a lot about RevOps as a whole. And I've had just some great learning experiences with him. And so I think he would be an amazing guest on your show. I would also say, my counterpart here at Sisense, Maggie Cerami, she is in charge of RevOps here at Sisense and has some great thoughts and insights and has a really cool career path in which she's taken. I think those two are probably the first ones that pop to mind, but I'll probably end up giving you a list of others I think of after this podcast.
And we're big fans of Mike too.
Yes, he's fantastic.
We'd love to have them, Stas. Lastly, before we sign off here for this episode, where can people find you? You've mentioned your Etsy shop. How can people get in touch with you? How can they follow what's next in your career, or maybe come ask you questions about RevOps or business systems?
Yeah, so I am on LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out to me, message me. I'm happy to answer any questions, give you advice, talk through anything. And actually that'd be it, because I'm on no other social media. I'm kind of against it, if I'm being completely honest, but LinkedIn, I think, is a good networking tool, and it's a little against other sides.
I can't tell at all from your analog preferences for vacation selections.
Oh, that's great.
And for Sisense, where can people find out more about the company and also the open positions that you are hiring for?
Yeah, definitely check out our website, sisense.com, SISENSE. And feel free to look at the careers page within our website. We have many different opportunities, even outside of the RevOps here at Sisense.
Well, Stas, I really appreciate you spending the time with us. We both do. You've shared so much, and I think some of the key takeaways for me are that nothing is irreversible. That we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, but you sharing about planning ahead and preparing before will help cover things. I appreciate you sharing your story and the importance of networking along the way, and also that mentor's advice about doing the job you want. I think some things might go haywire if people stop doing the job they have a bit, but you certainly can start taking on aspects of that. And we've seen so many folks step through the admin ranks over the years, step into administration, and then grow within administration, doing exactly what you described. So I think it's really great advice. We really appreciate having you on the show today.
No, yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. I love talking about this stuff, so it's definitely fun and a passion for me.
And for our audience who's listening to the podcast today, if you enjoyed listening to us geek out, or rather geeking out with us about business systems and process and technology, please subscribe to the podcast. Please like it, favorite it, whatever it is on your preferred podcasting platform, and tell a friend, tell a colleague about it. Thank you again for being on the show, Stas.
Yes, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And this has been another exciting episode of RevOps Rockstars. See you next time.
Stay classy, Rockstars.
And that wraps up another episode. Thank you so much for joining us. For show notes and other episodes, visit RevOpsRockstars.com. RevOps Rockstars is sponsored by OpFocus. Visit OpFocus.com to learn more about how OpFocus helps SaaS companies scale their revenue operations.